Without objection.
Mr. President, I have an amendment at the desk. It's Amendment 4300. I ask that it be called up.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Florida, Mr. LeMieux, proposes an amendment numbered 4300 to Amendment 4369. At the
Mr. President, I
end of
ask
the
that
amendment,
we dispense with the reading of the amendment.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I've offered Amendment 4300 today. It is a piece of legislation that Senator Wicker and Senator Risch and Senator Gregg have joined me in, and it's called the 2007 solution. Mr. President, the number one problem facing this country is our out-of-control spending. It is to a point that it is unsustainable. And Mr. President, I am new here to the Senate. I came last September. My background is in business as well as in state government in Florida. In both of those venues, I had the responsibility, both in chairing a business that I helped to run, as well as being the governor's chief of staff in Florida, to make sure that ends met. In the business that I worked in, I would look at receipts, and we could only spend as much money as we took in. In state government, we had a balanced budget requirement, have a balanced budget requirement in Florida. When the economy went bad in 2007, when I was the governor's chief of staff, I would be on the phone with the budget people and almost weekly monitoring how much money was coming in, because I knew we could only spend as much as we had. We had three choices if revenues declined. We could raise taxes, we could cut spending, or we could find a new source of revenue. We did not have the option of spending money we didn't have. So I always knew that there was a problem in Washington, that Washington didn't understand those basic dynamics that families in Florida around the country have to deal with in terms of making ends meet. The same decisions that families make around their kitchen tables to decide, well, we can't afford it this month, we're going to have to put it off till next, or we're going to have to cut down on some of this spending so that we make sense of our fiscal house. I knew that didn't happen in Washington, but I never knew the degree to which it did not happen. Now, when I came here and was sworn in on September of last year, the national debt of this country was $12 trillion. That is a staggering amount, and it's a number that's hard for us to get our brains around. $1 trillion, what does it mean? Well, a trillion is 1,000 billion. 1,000 billion dollars. A billion is 1,000 million. And just to put it into some perspective, if you took dollar bills and put them on the floor and laid them side by side, $1 million would cover 2 football fields. $1 billion would cover Key West, Florida. 3.4 square miles of $1 bills carpeting Key West, Florida. $1 trillion would cover Rhode Island twice. If you stacked $1 trillion of $1 bills on the ground up into the sky, it would go 600 miles into the sky. When I came here in September, this government owed $12 trillion in money that it shouldn't have spent in the past, that it couldn't afford to spend, and was carrying that debt. That was bad enough. But, Mr. President, since the time that time is eclipsed, now we're in June of 2010, now the national debt is $13 trillion. It has gone up $1 trillion in less than a year's time. It took 200 years for this country to amass its first $1 trillion in debt. And we just did another trillion in less than 1 year's time. Right now, in our budget, we spend $200 billion a year paying interest on the debt, on expenditures that we shouldn't have made in the past. $200 billion. At our current rate of spending, as projected by the White House, by the end of this decade, we'll spend $900 billion a year just making interest payments on debt. By 2020, it is estimated that our debt, our national debt, will not be $13 trillion, it'll be $25.7 trillion. And when we get to that point, Mr. President, our country's going to fail. This is not just a problem for our children and our grandchildren, it is a problem for all of us. $900 billion, that's more than we spend for fighting both wars and all of the expenditures for the Defense Department right now. And we're going to be paying that just in interest? And perhaps most troubling of all is this fact. Today, the money that we take in revenues is only enough to cover Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, the entitlements. Every other dollar that we spend for every other function of government, from the men and women who keep us free and safe in the military, to the FAA who guides your plane, to the roads that you drive on, to the Department of Labor, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Agriculture, every other function of government is borrowed. It is unsustainable. Now, I'm new enough to Washington to not think that this is normal. This still seems bizarre to me. And what this body and what the body down the hall fails to do is to set priorities and say, you know, we're going to afford this, but we can't afford that, just like families do, just like the state government in Tallahassee does, just like businesses do every day. And we don't go into the agencies now that are spending all this money and say, are they spending money on things that are effective, efficient? Are they getting bang for the buck? No, what we do in Washington is we just create new programs. We just passed this financial regulatory reform bill. And instead of firing all the people at the SEC who failed to do their job in policing Wall Street, we create a new governmental institution. Because that's what Washington does. More and more layers of government on top of government, with nobody looking to see what government is doing now and whether your tax dollars are being spent effectively and efficiently. Because there's no mechanism in place to balance the budget. Now, I wish we had a balanced budget amendment. I wish we had to do what our states had to do. This past spring in Florida, our state leaders had to sit down when there was less revenues than there had been in the past, and they had to make decisions about what to cut. That's what leaders do. We don't do that in Washington. But, Mr. President, I have an amendment, a proposal that would get us into a mechanism to at least have the debate about how we can save this country by stemming this uncontrollable spending. It's called the 2007 solution. It would require this, simply. Each year, the majority leader would be required to offer a piece of legislation that would have 50 hours of debate where we would have to go back to 2007 spending levels. Why 2007? Well, 2007 was the last year that we had a robust economy. It wasn't until December of that year that we entered into recession. When I talk with most Floridians, they would be happy to have the money that they made in 2007 as income in 2010. It was before the stimulus. It should be enough for us to live off of. And it's not like things were being done efficiently, effectively in 2007. It's not like someone was going into the agencies trying to chop out waste and abuse, set priorities. It wasn't being done there either. So there should be plenty of wiggle room. So if we go back to 2000 level spending at $2.729 trillion, by 2013 we'd balance the budget, and by 2020, instead of having a $25.7 trillion national debt, we cut the current national debt in half, and it'd be somewhere around $6 trillion. And we'd save America. So what this amendment does, what this proposal does, is requires the majority leader to offer an amendment where we will have 50 hours of debate on the floor of the Senate, as they will in the House, to set spending levels at 2007 levels. And guess what we're going to have to do then? We're going to have to be adults, we're going to have to be leaders, and we're going to have to make decisions about what's important. The $90 billion that Washington spends every year to subsidize different businesses around this country, is that important? The billions of dollars that go into earmarks, are they important? Could we not cut 10% from each agency, 20% from each agency? The $100 billion of Medicare fraud a year, could we not combat that? Would we not then have a motivation, an impetus to actually start doing better by the American people and watching the dollars that they send to us and spending them as if they were our own and doing it wisely? My amendment doesn't say what has to be cut. It does say there won't be any tax increases. We don't need to create more revenue and create more of a problem, because trust me, if we create more revenue, this Congress will just spend it. We don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. So let's have this debate. Who's afraid of a discussion? Let's go back and forth and say what we could cut. Should we cut things in the Department of Defense? Is there not waste, fraud, and abuse in the Department of Defense? Sure there is. Let's cut it. Secretary Gates wants to cut spending in defense. No one wants to cut our capabilities. But are there things that we could do without and do things more efficiently? Not just defense, but every department of government. There's 100,000 people working at the Department of Agriculture. By best estimate, and it's less than this, 1 out of every 30, there's one person at the Department of Agriculture for every 30 farmers. What are all these people doing? Has someone really looked under the hood at that agency? President's now asking all of the agency heads, the cabinet members, to look for 5% cuts, some which would go towards deficit reduction, some which would go towards other programs they could spend money on. When's the last time we cut any agency? You know, we haven't had fiscal sanity in the Congress since the mid-90s when we balanced the budget. We're talking 13 years, 14 years. Someone needs to look under the hood of these agencies and set priorities. This amendment will require that discussion to happen. We're going to have to look at the entitlement programs. We're going to have to look at Medicare. We're going to have to look at Social Security. This is not a popular thing to talk about. You're not going to see my colleagues come to the floor of this body and talk about reforming entitlements because it's politically dangerous. But the truth is, if we don't reform them, they're not going to be there for our seniors and the generations that follow. We're going to have the courage of our convictions. We're going to have to care about the next generation more than we care about the next election. So, Mr. President, I hope that the 2007 solution will pass. It does not require that any specific program be cut. It just requires that we have a debate about it every year. And if the majority leader doesn't introduce it, the minority leader can. If the minority leader doesn't introduce it, any senator can. 50 hours of privileged debate. It can go through committees, but only for 30 days, so it doesn't get stuck in the committees. It would require 3/5 majority to pass. That's our peculiarity of the Senate on our 60-vote rule, so it makes sense and it's consistent with the history and the precedent of this body. So, Mr. President, I want to conclude with this. For us to be here and to do anything else without tackling this debt issue is unfair to the American people. I've got 4 little kids. My wife and I just welcomed a new daughter into the world. It's our first daughter because we have 3 young sons. And my greatest fear is that my 4 kids, or one of the 4 kids, someday will come to me and say, "Dad, I'm moving to a foreign country. I'm going to go to Brazil or India or China or pick your country because the opportunities in that country are greater than the ones in the United States." The greatest threat we have to this country today is our inability to control this out-of-control spending. And if we don't do it, we will violate the American creed, which is that we leave this country in a better place than we found it for each generation that follows. So I hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will embrace this. Again, it doesn't require anything to be cut. It requires a discussion and a good debate on what should be cut. And it sets parameter that if we held ourselves to that cap, we could save this country. There are folks I know on the other side of the aisle who care about this issue. I've talked to them. This is not a Republican issue. This is not a Democrat issue. This is a moral issue. It's a moral obligation of the people who serve in this body and the one down the hall to fix this out-of-control spending. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I didn't intend to speak again, except that after hearing my colleague, I do feel it's important just to say I'm not speaking to the specifics at all of